This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Nitzahone, and it's Monday, so that means it's time for another MTG Top 10, the series where I rank cards based on their historical performance at Magic's highest level of competition. At least that's normally what I do in this series. This video is a little bit different. So, a couple of years ago, I did an MTG Top 10 on bad cards that suddenly became good, and it was a list of cards that had taken the longest from being printed to putting up a premier event Top 8. It's actually the most viewed video on this channel. The cards on the list were largely cards that had been bulk rares for a long time, and then suddenly something changed in the game, and that led to them becoming good. This MTG Top 10 is the companion piece to that because it looks at the opposite. Bad cards that used to be good. In other words, this list looks at cards that we look at today and think, wow, that's pretty bad. But earlier in Magic's history, they were actually considered good. In a lot of ways, this list takes a look at power creep over the years. It's worth noting power creep mostly only applies to creatures when we look at Magic's history because spells in the early part of the game were actually insanely powerful and they're kind of weaker now on average. But creatures have gotten significantly stronger, and that's something we're going to see in this video. To make this list, a card had to meet some additional criteria, in addition to just passing the wow, that card's really bad test. In particular, a card had to have at least one top 8 in a premier event in Magic's distant past, and it has to not be widely played in EDH today. The first part establishes that the card used to be good, and the latter part establishes that the card isn't good at all today, and obviously none of these cards are played in competitive Magic these days either. As we look at each of the cards on this list, I'm going to discuss what made each of them good in Magic's distant past by discussing the decks they were in that metagame, while also establishing just how bad the cards would be today if they were reprinted. Alright, let's get to the list. At number 10, I've got Uthden Troll. This 3-mana 2/2 can regenerate for a single red mana. It's probably the least bad of the cards on this list, hence its place at number 10, because I could see this at least being a semi-playable card in Limited if it were reprinted. However, this is not a card that would get remotely close to being in a constructed deck. By today's standards, it's super inefficient, and adding Regenerate to the mix doesn't even get close to making up for that. These days, we get 3-mana 2/2s with all kinds of upside. Just look at a card like Pia Nalar, which has the same casting cost as the Troll. However, between 1994 and 1995, Uthden Troll was regularly played in mono-red aggro decks, if you can believe that. Players were working with much smaller card pools, and for the time, a 3-mana 2/2 wasn't completely abysmal, and it was enough size that the Regenerate effect was actually kind of good. It could also negate a lot of removal. Uthden Troll managed to get its top 8s during the first 2 years of competitive Magic, and hasn't even gotten close to doing it again since 1995. At number 9, I have Yoshin Soldier, which I actually called Yoshin Soldier as a kid for whatever reason. I'm not sure which way you pronounce it, but either way, it's number 9 here, and it's in a somewhat similar spot to the Troll. It would be an alright card in Limited, provided the format had some reason to be playing artifacts. However, these days, a 3-mana 1/4 with Vigilance wouldn't ever be played in Constructed, even in a deck that was obsessed with artifacts. I mean, look at Etched Champion, which has the same mana cost, and you'll see what I mean. Back in the mid-90s, though, the Soldier was a pretty nice defensive creature, capable of blocking a lot of the heavily played aggro creatures of the time, like Kurdape and Uthden Troll. This allowed it to put up a couple of top 8s in the standard of its time, mostly appearing in Necropotence decks. At number 8, it is Isan Shade. This thing has protection from white, which is cool, but it has terrible stats for the cost. Even if there was a metagame in standard these days where literally every deck played white, no one would play Isan Shade, as it's just too slow and inefficient. For comparison, these days when we spend 3 generic and 3 black mana, we expect something like, I don't know, Massacre Worm. However, at the time, the stats didn't look as bad, and white was a heavily played card in the standard, with Swords to Plowshares appearing in more than half the decks. This meant that the Shade provided immunity from what was probably the best removal spell in the format, while also being able to attack through one of the best creatures of the time, Serra Angel. Additionally, most black removal at the time only killed non-black creatures, and most red burn at the time couldn't do 5 damage. So even though this card is undoubtedly bad by today's standards, the Shade was surprisingly hard to kill back in the day. At number 7, I have Org. 5 mana for a 6/6 Trampler is pretty nice, even by today's standards, but in Magic's olden days, a creature that efficient had to come with some massive downsides, and Org definitely does. He can't block anything that's too big, and he can't even attack if your opponent just has an untapped creature with power 3 or greater. That means that in a lot of games these days, it would just never be able to attack, and it would barely be able to block. However, the downsides were worth the massive upside at the time. That certainly isn't true today, but a 5 mana 6/6 with Trample was unheard of when Fallen Empires came out. As a result, Org found its way into a lot of aggro decks between 1995 and 1996. Some of its success also relates to the metagame at the time, as many players were playing smaller creatures for the most part, so the Org was able to do its thing more often than it would be able to today. At number 6, it is Tal'Rum Minotaur. It isn't particularly interesting to talk about, since it's just a 4 mana 3/3 with haste, but that would be something that would almost always get cut in limited, and would never be played in constructed. If you want a creature with haste for the same mana cost, just look at something like Akum Firebird. However, in its own time, it managed 2 Pro Tour top 8s. Like I've said about a lot of these creatures, this was way more efficient back then than it is today. At number 5, I have Storm Shaman. This starts out as a 3 mana 0/4, which is awful, but it also comes with fire breathing, which is a thing, I guess, but not exactly impressive on an unevasive creature with 0 power. It does mean that it can block things and attack a little more effectively than it might look at first glance, but you have to sink a lot of mana into it to make that actually be true, and it just isn't worth it by today's standards. At the time, sort of like with Yoshin Soldier, it gave you a surprisingly good blocker, since it could stop many creatures from being able to attack. At number 4, it's another red creature, Goblin Elite Infantry. While we've seen a lot of red creatures so far, the top 3 cards on this list aren't red, so that trend is about to end. Anyway, Goblin Elite Infantry is a bear with downside. That seems crazy today, as vanilla 2 mana 2/2s are basically garbage, so giving one a downside seems crazy, especially because the downside here is so massive. The infantry becomes a 1/1 when it gets blocked, which means it can be wrecked by just about any creature blocking it. At the time, it was really only green that got 2 mana 2/2s, so anytime you printed one in another color, it had to have downsides. These days, when we spend this kind of mana, we expect something like Dragonkin Berserker, and he's a 2 mana 2/2 with upside for days. At number 3, it is Icy Town. It has the distinction of being the only non-creature to make the list, but it does make creature tokens. So this is a 6 mana sorcery, so it better do something good, but it really doesn't, not by today's standards anyway. 6 mana for 4 1/1 tokens is laughably bad, especially at sorcery speed. Compare it to something like Elspeth Sun's Champion, and you really see what I mean. So why did people play it in Magic's early days? Well, at the time, it really wasn't that easy to get multiple bodies out of a single card, or to go super wide with a single card, and Icy Town was unique in its ability to do that. People hadn't really seen the token generating effects we're used to seeing today, and this was good enough to find its way into some Naya aggro decks at the time. At number 2, it is Ernangen. The Djinn is better than a lot of cards we've seen on this list so far. In fact, it may be the best card to make the list, but there's a huge chasm between how good it once was and how good it is today, and that's what makes it the number 2 card on this list. Ernangen was considered one of the game's best creatures and was heavily played between 1994 and 1998, and today, almost nobody plays him in EDH, and if he were reprinted, nobody would play him in Constructed either. This is because he comes with a huge downside of giving an opposing creature Forest Walk. That means that, in most scenarios, you're going to make something unblockable. In Magic's early days, a 4 mana 4/5 was worth that downside because it was just huge, even big enough to tangle with Sarah Angel and Singer Vampire, 2 dominant creatures from the same time. Ernangen was such a big factor back in the day that there was even a deck named for it called Ernangeddon, which sought to get the Djinn down and then cast Armageddon, at which point the Forest Walk part of the card wouldn't matter, and you'd have the largest creature on the board, so you would probably just win. But yeah, this does not compare very favorably with a card like Ripjaw Raptor, which has the same casting cost and stats, and everything in its text box is upside. And at number 1, it is Jade Leech. The Leech has a lot in common with Ernangen. They have the same number of Premier Event top 8s, and they are super efficient green creatures that come with massive downside. Jade Leech is played even less widely in EDH, and I think it's also safe to say that the downside is even more massive than Ernangen's. Making all your green spells cost more just isn't worth it for a 4 mana 5/5. Jade Leech was played at the top of a curve, though, in red-green aggro decks in both block and standard, where the plan was to curve out with the Leech coming down last. This helped minimize the downside of the card since you weren't super likely to need to cast more spells if you curved out that way, and if you did, you were at 4 mana anyway, and the tax wasn't completely backbreaking. These days though, if you want a 4 mana 5/5, you can just play Polukranos. Well, those are my picks for the 10 bad cards that used to be good. Do you think there are any cards I missed? If you want to own any of these cards, because, I don't know, maybe you're making a cube of intentionally bad cards, you can find direct links for each of them in the description to Card Kingdom's store. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it. If you want to make sure you catch future MTG Top 10s, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a video. If you want to catch up on past MTG Top 10s, and at this point there's more than 400 of them, you should see the playlist on your screen shortly. Lastly, if you want to help support the channel, you can on Patreon. Thanks for watching.